I know. I don't need to believe. I know.
Picture yourself born into a community with practices you'd consider absurd if you encountered them as an outsider. Values that make no rational sense. Behaviors that serve no one. But you weren't an outsider. You were raised there. And that changes everything. What happens when the water you swim in is toxic, but you've never known any other ocean? You develop loyalty to patterns you never consciously chose. You honor agreements you never signed. You become faithful to traditions that harm you, simply because they arrived before your capacity to question them. We absorb the world as children without filters, without choice, without the ability to distinguish what serves us from what destroys us. And those early absorptions become the invisible architecture of our entire lives. They shape how we see ourselves, how we interpret reality, how we move through the world. Carl Jung understood this when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Those unconscious patterns, those invisible loyalties, they're not just influencing your decisions. They are your decisions. They're the lens through which you see every possibility, every relationship, every version of yourself that could exist. And most people never realize they're operating under contracts they never agreed to. This isn't about judgment. It's about recognition. Because once you see these invisible loyalties clearly, once you understand the agreements running in the background of your consciousness, you gain something most people never access: the power to choose which commitments actually serve you.
More understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger, and we are pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man, far too little.
Let's be clear about what we're dealing with. These aren't casual preferences or minor habits. These are energetic contracts, psychological commitments so deep they function like laws of physics in your personal universe. They're invisible not because they're subtle, but because they're so fundamental you mistake them for reality itself. Think about gravity. You don't wake up every morning and decide whether to honor gravity. It's simply the condition under which you operate. These invisible loyalties work the same way. They're the gravity of your psychological world, pulling you back toward familiar patterns even when those patterns suffocate you. And here's what makes them particularly dangerous: their power comes from remaining unseen. The moment you name them, you've already begun to break their hold. But until then, they control everything while you believe you're making free choices. The first invisible loyalty most people carry: I am a victim of circumstances beyond my control. Now, before this gets misunderstood, let's make a crucial distinction. Being victimized is real. If you've experienced abuse, manipulation, betrayal, trauma, you were victimized. That's a fact, not a feeling. That happened to you. No one's denying that. But there's a difference between experiencing victimization and adopting victimhood as an identity. One is something that happened. The other is something you become. You can be the victim of an assault without becoming someone whose entire identity revolves around being assaulted. You can experience a toxic relationship without defining yourself permanently as someone broken by toxic relationships. You can have a difficult childhood without carrying "damaged by my childhood" as your primary self-concept for the next 40 years. The shift happens when you move from "I was victimized" to "I am a victim." From past tense to present continuous. From event to identity. And here's what people miss about this distinction: holding on to victim identity isn't about getting attention or avoiding responsibility. It's deeper than that. It's about maintaining coherence with a story you've told yourself for so long that changing it feels like dying. If you've built your entire understanding of why your life is the way it is around the fact that you were victimized, then healing from that victimization threatens your entire explanatory framework. If you're no longer the person damaged by what happened, then who are you? If that past trauma no longer explains your present limitations, what does? This is why people resist letting go of victim identity even when they consciously want to heal. The identity provides certainty. It explains everything. It's a complete worldview. And humans will cling to a painful certainty rather than face an uncertain freedom. Watch how this plays out. Someone experiences genuine trauma. They build their understanding of themselves around that trauma. Years pass. The trauma is no longer active, but the identity remains. Every new challenge gets filtered through that identity. Every setback becomes more evidence of the original wound. Every limitation gets explained by what happened years ago. I can't trust people because of what my ex did to me. I can't succeed because of how my family treated me. I can't change because of what I experienced. The original victimization was real. But the current limitation is a loyalty, not a reality. It's faithfulness to a story that once explained everything but now imprisons everything. And the cost of this loyalty? Everything that could emerge if you weren't spending all your energy maintaining consistency with who you used to be. Every possibility that exists in your present gets sacrificed to remain faithful to your past. The question isn't whether you were victimized. The question is whether you're going to let that victimization define what you're capable of becoming. Second, invisible loyalty. I must be accepted by others to survive. This one has evolutionary roots. For most of human history, exile from the tribe meant death. Being rejected by your community wasn't just emotionally painful, it was existentially threatening. Our ancestors who didn't care about group acceptance didn't survive long enough to become anyone's ancestors. So we're wired for this. The need for acceptance, for belonging, for being valued by the group, it's coded into our deepest survival mechanisms. That's not weakness. That's evolution. But here's where the wiring becomes a trap. We no longer live in conditions where group rejection equals death. You can leave your family and survive. You can reject your social circle's values and build a new one. You can stand completely alone and not only survive but thrive in ways that would be impossible if you stayed where you didn't belong. The evolutionary mechanism is still running, but the environment has changed. And that mismatch creates suffering. Because when you prioritize acceptance over authenticity, you're not making a strategic choice for survival. You're sacrificing the core of who you are to maintain comfort within a group that probably isn't even serving you. Watch what this looks like in practice. Someone starts changing. They develop new values, new interests, new ways of seeing the world. But their friend group, their family, their community, they're invested in who this person used to be. So pressure appears. You've changed. You're not yourself anymore. You used to be fun. You're acting weird. Translation: you're violating our implicit agreement that you would stay the same so we don't have to examine ourselves. And here's where the invisible loyalty kicks in. The person feels that ancient evolutionary panic. Group rejection. Exile. Danger. So they compress themselves back into the shape the group expects. They abandon the emerging version of themselves to maintain acceptance. But the group isn't actually offering real acceptance. They're offering conditional tolerance based on your willingness to stay limited in ways that make them comfortable. Real acceptance doesn't require you to stay small. Real love doesn't demand you stop growing. Real relationships can hold your transformation without making it about their comfort. If people only accept you when you're performing a version of yourself that pleases them, that's not acceptance. That's a transaction. And the price is your authenticity. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who your conditioning says you should be. And it's terrifying because it often requires violating the invisible loyalty to acceptance. The cost of freedom isn't just walking away from people who don't serve you. It's walking toward the unknown of who you might become without their approval defining you. It's the courage to say, "This is who I am." You don't have to like it. You don't have to accept it. But I'm not compressing myself anymore. And here's the paradox. When you stop desperately needing acceptance, you often find genuine connection. Because the people who show up for your authentic self are choosing you, not the performance you've been exhausting yourself maintaining. But first, you have to break the invisible contract that says other people's acceptance is more valuable than your own. Third invisible loyalty: I am faithful to my past. Your past doesn't exist. Not as a thing you can point to. It's a memory, reconstructed every time you access it, changed every time you tell the story, shaped by who you are now as much as by what actually happened. Neuroscience has demonstrated this repeatedly. Memory isn't playback. It's reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you're creating that memory again, influenced by your current emotional state, your current beliefs, your current needs. Which means the past you're being loyal to isn't even real in the way you think it is. It's a story you're telling yourself about what happened, filtered through every interpretation you've layered onto it since. But most people don't know this. They treat their past like a fixed entity, an unchangeable reality that determines who they are and what they're capable of. They build their entire identity around events that exist only as interpreted memories in their current consciousness. I had a difficult childhood, so I struggle with relationships. I failed at that thing years ago, so I'm not good at this type of challenge. I was betrayed by someone I trusted, so I don't let people close anymore. These aren't observations. They're vows. Promises to remain consistent with a version of yourself that was created by circumstances that no longer exist. And here's the mechanism that keeps this loyalty in place: coherence. Humans have a deep need for their life to make sense as a continuous story. If you've told yourself for years that you are a certain way because of what happened to you, changing that means admitting the story was wrong. And admitting the story was wrong feels like admitting you've wasted years living a lie. So instead, people protect the story. They find evidence that confirms it. They interpret new experiences through it. They reject possibilities that don't fit it. All to maintain coherence with a past that's already gone. But here's what that loyalty costs: the present. Every moment spent maintaining consistency with who you used to be is a moment unavailable for discovering who you could become. Every experience filtered through your past story is an experience you can't actually have fresh. The past had value. It created you. It taught you. It gave you the raw material of your current consciousness. But you don't honor that value by remaining imprisoned by it. You honor it by transforming it. Alchemists talked about turning lead into gold. That's what you do with your past. You take the heavy, toxic material of difficult experiences and you transmute it into wisdom, strength, perspective. You don't carry the lead around forever proving how heavy your burden is. You use it as fuel for transformation. Every difficult thing that happened to you can become a resource rather than a limitation. But only if you break the invisible loyalty to remaining the person those difficult things happened to. Your past is not a life sentence. It's raw material. And you're the one who decides what to build with it. Fourth invisible loyalty: I am afraid of my desired life. This is where all the other loyalties converge into one binding force. Because if you're loyal to being a victim, loyal to needing acceptance, loyal to your past limitations, how could you possibly allow yourself to move toward the life you actually want? The desired life represents a threat to every identity you've been maintaining. It requires you to become someone who has capacity you've spent years insisting you don't have. It demands you embody confidence you've told yourself you can't feel. It asks you to inhabit a version of yourself that contradicts the story you've been living. So instead of moving toward what you want, you develop intimate familiarity with what you don't want. You know disappointment deeply. You understand limitation completely. You're comfortable with struggle because you've spent years there. But success? Fulfillment? Actually getting what you want? That's foreign territory. And humans fear the unfamiliar more than they fear the painful if the painful is at least predictable. This is why people self-sabotage right before breakthrough. Not because they don't want success, but because success requires them to violate every invisible loyalty they've been honoring. It requires them to become someone new. And becoming someone new feels like death to the person you've been. The fear isn't about the desired life itself. It's about the identity shift required to have that life. It's about stepping into a version of yourself you have no reference point for. If you've spent 20 years being the person who struggles, the person who almost makes it but not quite, the person who has potential but never quite realizes it, then actually becoming the person who succeeds, who thrives, who realizes their potential, that's not an upgrade. That's an identity death and rebirth. And most people would rather stay in familiar suffering than face that transformation. Here's what makes this particularly painful: you're not consciously choosing limitation. You're not waking up every morning and deciding to sabotage your life. The invisible loyalty is running in the background, creating resistance that feels like external reality rather than internal conflict. You think you can't do the thing. You think you're not capable. You think the circumstances are wrong. But really, you're being faithful to an agreement you made years ago about who you are and what's possible for you. Breaking this loyalty means getting comfortable with discomfort. It means building intimacy with new sensations, the sensation of succeeding, of being capable, of things working out, of your life actually improving. These positive sensations can feel more threatening than negative ones if you've spent years developing tolerance for negativity but no tolerance for genuine well-being. These four invisible loyalties function as an interconnected system. Each one reinforces the others. Being loyal to victim identity supports needing acceptance, because victims need protection. Needing acceptance supports loyalty to the past, because changing threatens group belonging. Loyalty to the past supports fear of the desired life, because the desired life contradicts who you've been. They're not separate problems. They're one unified mechanism keeping you locked in place. But here's the powerful part: because they're interconnected, breaking one weakens all of them. Every time you choose authenticity over acceptance, you're also choosing present possibility over past limitation. Every time you refuse to identify as a victim, you're also refusing to fear your desired life. The system works both ways. It can imprison you completely, or liberating yourself from one loyalty can cascade into liberating yourself from all of them. This isn't accomplished in one dramatic moment. It's not a single decision that changes everything instantly. It's a daily practice of recognition and choice. Every day presents moments where you can either honor the old loyalties or choose new ones. Someone judges you for changing. Do you compress yourself back into the old shape, or do you remain faithful to your authentic growth? Something triggers the old victim story. Do you replay it as identity, Or do you acknowledge it as something that happened without letting it define what's possible now? An opportunity appears that matches your desired life. Do you find reasons why it won't work, or do you feel the fear and move forward anyway? Small moments. Daily choices. Gradual accumulation of evidence that you can be someone different than who you've been. And here's what nobody tells you about this process. When you start breaking these invisible loyalties, things feel strange. Wrong, even. Not because you're making mistakes, but because you're experiencing sensations you have no familiarity with. Success feels weird if you're used to failure. Healthy relationships feel suspicious if you're used to toxic ones. Things going well feels like a setup for disaster if you're used to things falling apart. That strangeness isn't a sign you're on the wrong path. It's a sign you're on a new path. Your nervous system hasn't caught up yet. Your sense of normal is still calibrated to the old loyalties. But if you keep choosing the new path despite the strangeness, eventually the strangeness becomes familiar. The new loyalties become your new normal. And what used to feel like home, the victim identity, the desperate need for acceptance, the worship of your past limitations, the fear of your desired life, starts feeling foreign. That's when you know the invisible loyalties have lost their power. Not because they're gone, but because you've built something stronger, conscious choice about who you're actually committed to becoming. The most important skill in breaking invisible loyalties isn't force. It's recognition. Because you can't break agreements you don't know you've made. Start by watching yourself. Not with judgment, but with curiosity. When do you compress yourself to gain acceptance? When do you tell the victim story as though it's happening now rather than something that happened? When do you reference your past as evidence for current limitations? When do you feel resistance to opportunities that match what you claim to want? These moments reveal the invisible loyalties in action. And the moment you see them, you've already weakened their hold. Because invisible loyalties depend on remaining invisible. Once you can say, "I'm choosing acceptance over authenticity right now," you're no longer trapped in the pattern. You're making a conscious choice. And conscious choices can be changed. This doesn't mean the loyalties disappear immediately. They're deep. They've been running for years, maybe decades. But recognition is the beginning of transformation. Every time you notice yourself honoring an invisible loyalty, you're creating space between the pattern and your behavior. You're inserting consciousness where there used to be only automatic response. And in that space, choice becomes possible. Breaking invisible loyalties isn't just about removal. It's about replacement. You don't just stop being loyal to limiting patterns. You start being loyal to liberating ones. What would it mean to be faithful to your growth rather than your limitations? To honor your present potential rather than your past constraints? To value your authenticity more than others' acceptance? To embrace your desired life rather than fear it? These aren't just nice ideas. They're alternative loyalties. New contracts you can consciously choose to honor. The difference is awareness. The old loyalties controlled you because you didn't know they existed. The new loyalties empower you because you're choosing them consciously, day by day, moment by moment. Be loyal to your transformation, even when it makes others uncomfortable. Be faithful to your healing, even when your old identity protests. Honor your capacity to change, even when every familiar pattern insists you can't. These new loyalties won't feel natural at first. They'll feel like performance, like you're pretending to be someone you're not. That's normal. You're not pretending. You're becoming. And becoming always feels strange until it becomes who you are.
On my way to school, I stepped out of a mist. It was just as if I had been in a mist, walking in a mist, And I stepped out of it, and I knew I am what I am. And then I thought, but what have I been before? And then I found that I had been in a mist, not knowing to differentiate myself from things. I was just one thing among many things.
Here's what changes when you break invisible loyalties: everything. Your relationships shift because you're no longer available for dynamics that required you to stay small. Your opportunities expand because you're no longer automatically rejecting possibilities that don't match your old story. Your sense of self transforms because you're no longer maintaining an identity built on limitations. And most importantly, you discover something most people never access: the power to consciously choose what you're committed to. Not the commitments you inherited. Not the loyalties you absorbed before you could question them. But the conscious, deliberate choice about who you're becoming and what matters to you. That's not freedom from all constraints. It's freedom to choose your constraints. To select the commitments that serve your highest possibility rather than unconsciously honoring the ones that keep you limited. Jung's quote becomes real in your experience: when you make the unconscious conscious, it stops directing your life. The invisible loyalties lose their power not because you've destroyed them, but because you've seen them. And what you can see, you can choose about. The contracts you never signed are the ones running your life. Until you recognize them. Until you question whether you want to keep honoring agreements you never consciously made. And then you become the author of your own commitments. Faithful not to who you've been, but to who you're becoming. Loyal not to the patterns that limit you, but to the possibilities that liberate you. That's the difference between being controlled by invisible loyalties and choosing conscious commitments. One keeps you trapped in a story you didn't write. The other lets you become the author of your own life. The loyalties are invisible until you see them. And once you see them, everything changes.